All right, so welcome back. It's been a minute since we last talked. However, the videos are back. All right, so now that we got supply and demand out of the way, we are on to an AKS pertaining to something known as market structures. Now, remember, we have to know what a market is. In a market, you have buyers and you have sellers. Somebody's buying something, somebody's selling something. So remember that. All right, so on to 25B. Market structures. So there are 4 types of market structures that you absolutely have to be aware of. The first being perfect competition, or sometimes known as pure competition. The second one is monopolistic competition. The third one is something known as an oligopoly. And the fourth and final market structure is something you've all heard of, monopolies, right? So those are the 4 types of market structures that you have to know for your test. So we're going to go over characteristics regarding each one of these market structures. So the very first market structure that we're going to begin with is pure competition or perfect competition. With this market structure, write this down in your notes. The number of sellers, there are a lot of sellers. So the number of sellers is many for this one. There are many sellers in a pure or perfect competitive market, right? The next thing that we have to write down, I'll give you just 1 second to write that down. The following thing we need to get down, still sticking with pure or perfect competition. Barriers to entry. They have low barriers to entry, meaning anybody can basically enter this particular market, right? And I'm going to give you an example in just 1 second. The third characteristic regarding pure or perfect competition is price control. There is no price control. You can't control how much you sell your products for. Case in point, you have to sell your product for whatever the going rate is of that item. Whatever the supply and demand dictates that item is sold for, you have to sell your product for that amount, right? And here's why. That leads me to the fourth thing, product differentiation. They have no product differentiation. What product differentiation is brand names. There's nothing that separates their products in a pure or perfect competition, right? In terms of competitive market, there's nothing, no way to tell the difference. For instance, let's use the concept of bananas, right? Whether you go to Kroger to get bananas, or Walmart to get bananas, or at the farmer's market to get bananas, or anywhere to get bananas, bananas are going to be relatively the same price because there's no distinction between bananas. A banana is a banana, right? It comes from the ground. There's no way to tell a product's difference in terms of produce. Potato's a potato, banana's a banana. So it might be a Chiquito banana. It could be another name of a banana, but there's no difference in that item. They're the same banana, right? Virtually. So therefore, one company can't sell their banana for $80 and the other one can't sell theirs for $1, right? So there's a going rate for those bananas, and everybody who produces bananas has to sell their bananas for that particular price. There's no Gucci bananas, right? Even if Gucci made a banana, they're not going to sell theirs for $800 because there's nothing to separate it from a Chiquito banana, right? Because they're essentially the same thing. All right, so on to the second market structure. This one is monopolistic competition. Just like before, just like with pure competition, they also have a large number of sellers. There are many sellers, so make sure you get that down in your notes for monopolistic competition. Barriers to entry, just like before, there is literally few barriers, so anybody can enter the market, right? For monopolistic competition. However, this is the big time difference. You need to get this down. Price control. In a monopolistic competitive market, there is control over price, and this is why. Because, and this is the fourth thing, write this down, product differentiation. They have product differentiation. It exists in a monopolistic competitive market. I'll give you an example. Fast food. You get McDonald's, Bojangles, Chick-fil-A, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, Little Caesars, Wendy's, Checkers. all of these fast food restaurants. I can't even name them all, right? Because they all are branded or have product differentiation. A McDonald's burger isn't the same as a Burger King's burger, which is not the same as a Wendy's burger, which is not the same as a Sonic burger, right? They sell the same products, but they are slightly different, right? So write that down in your notes. Monopolistic competition, they have product differentiation. Their products are similar, but not exact. Make sure you have that down. That's how you can tell the difference between monopolistic competition and pure competition. Remember, in a pure or perfect competition, all of the items are the same, right? Moving on. Now, the third market structure that we're going to talk about is an oligopoly. Oligopoly sounds kind of weird, I know, but it kind of goes with monopoly. Sounds similar, right? They are relatively similar, but there's a couple of differences. So in oligopoly, there are a few number of sellers. Write this down. Between 2 and 12 sellers makes up or constitutes an oligopoly, right? So with this example, you're talking about things like cell phones, right? So cell phones, you have 4 major carriers. You got Sprint, you got T-Mobile, you got AT&T, and you got Verizon. I know there's Metro and all of these little subsidiary companies, but they fall under those 4 major companies. There's only 4 major cell phone carriers in this country, right? So that would be an example of an oligopoly. There's only 4, and it's very hard to enter the market, which leads me to the next characteristic: barriers to entry. High. Get this in your notes. High barriers to entry. It is hard to get in this industry. Think about how hard it would be to make a cell phone company to compete with Sprint or AT&T or Verizon. Very hard. You got to build your own towers across the country for reception, for coverage, produce cell phones. You got to work out contracts with different phone carriers, which they already have contracts with the 4 major carriers. So very hard to enter the market. So high levels of barriers to entry, right? Another example of oligopoly would be airlines. Think about Delta, American, Spirit, Sprint. There's only like 5 or 6 American airlines, right? So with that being said, good example of oligopoly. There's only 5 or 6 carriers. So another thing, get this down. Put a star next to this. Price control. They do have price control, right? There's 2 ways the oligopolies operate. Either they can work together to come up with setting a price, or they can not work together and try to put each other out of business. Case in point, OPEC. These are the nations that produce the world's oil. They opt to come together and work out oil prices in which everybody makes a profit. But you take somebody like the automotive industry. There's only a few American automotive manufacturers, right? Ford, Chevrolet, or a few Dodge, right? But there's only like 5 or 6 car companies that are American. That's another example of an oligopoly. But in the car example, they try to put each other out of business by competition, by competing, right? So that's an oligopoly. Product differentiation, the last category for oligopolies. They do have product differentiation. Remember, branding, that means the same as brand names. So think about if you want a phone. This is another example of an oligopoly. You have 2 different operator options, right? You either have Android or you have iPhone, right? Not necessarily the iPhone, but the operating feature for the iPhone. So in that situation, you only have 2 choices. Product differentiation exists. So with airlines, you got Delta, you got American, you got Southwest. You have all of these different carriers, but they are distinct to their own brand specific ideas, right? So Delta, they have a different slogan than Southwest. They have different prices, they have different colors, different features, and they try to brand themselves to consumers so we can basically pick them. They try to stand out and try to make themselves more noticeable than the next company, right? So that's what product differentiation is. And yes, it does exist with oligopolies. Make sure you have that in your notes. So I know I said a lot about oligopolies. Let's kind of go backtrack. Number of sellers, very few, right? Between 2 and 12, right? There's a few companies that sell this particular item. So think about cell phones, right? Sprint, T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T. So there's only 4 companies. Think about soda, Coke and Pepsi. Those are the 2 companies that control the market in the soda industry, right? That's an oligopoly. So high barriers to entry. Think about how hard it would be to create an airline to compete with Delta, or how hard it would be to create a cell phone tower or many cell phone towers to compete with Sprint and Verizon, right? Very high levels to entry. So that's what separates oligopolies. And also the last thing we talked about, product differentiation. Yes, it does exist with oligopolies, but the main thing that you're going to need to know regarding oligopolies is how to pick an oligopoly out from a monopolistic competition feature. You need to be able to tell the difference. And the way you can do this is by high barriers to entry. It is super hard to enter the market as an oligopoly, right? Next thing. So we're going to talk about the 4th and final market structure. And this one is monopolies. Now, you need to make sure you get this down. A monopoly, just like it sounds, mono, one company only. So number of sellers, there's only one. And they have high barriers to entry, of course. They're the only person or only company that sells that particular product. So extremely high barriers to entry. It's almost impossible, right? Because they're the only ones that have this product. That leads me to the 3rd feature, price control. Yes, monopolies, they can control prices. The reason that they're able to control prices is because they are the only ones selling that product. Matter of fact, monopolies are known as price makers. Now, I want to kind of rewind a little bit, because the first one we talked about, the first market structure, dealt with pure or perfect competition, right? They had no brand names, easy to enter the market, right? No product differentiation. But remember, one thing about them, they could not control their price. They had to sell their products for the going rate, right? So therefore, pure competitive people that operate in that market are known as price takers. So you need to know the distinction. People that operate as a monopoly are known as price makers. They can set their own price because they're the only ones that have that product. People in a pure competitive market, they are known as price takers. They have to sell their product for whatever they can get for it, whatever the going rate is, right? So make sure you add that to your notes. I know I kind of skipped over that when we first talked about pure competition. So go back and add that to your notes. All right, so the first type of monopoly we're going to talk about is a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly, I'll give you an example. They're like power companies, like Walton EMC, the electric company, Georgia Power, City of Lawrenceville Gas, right? So gas companies, water companies, electric companies. The government typically hates monopolies. They absolutely cannot stand monopolies. However, in some situations, it makes sense for monopolies to exist. And this is why. Think about how unsightly it would be outside if we already have a lot of power poles, we have wires going to houses, wires going across towns, going across the country. So think about if they were allowed to compete. If these electric companies, if you had 10 electric companies, you would have all these poles and all these wires, and it wouldn't make any sense. And it costs a lot. The startup to get started in that line of business is tremendous. You're talking about fronting upwards of hundreds of millions of dollars to even get started, right? So if you had, suppose you put up $100 million to start your own electric company, but if you got 6 other electric companies in your area that you have to compete against, it's not going to be worth you providing that service because there's not enough customers for you to make money because you got to deal with the competition. So the government allows one monopoly in the area to dominate that area. And what the government does is they regulate them so they don't take advantage of us as consumers. So they don't charge us $1 million for our light bill, right? So there's some regulations put on monopolies, but remember, natural monopolies, they are things like Georgia Power, water company, gas company, utility companies, right? Make sure you got that down in your notes. All right, so the next type of monopoly, the second type of monopoly, is a geographical monopoly. The greatest example of this is sports teams. If we're talking about Georgia, if you want to go watch a Major League Baseball team, you only have one option, the Atlanta Braves, right? If you want to go watch an NBA team in Georgia, you have one option, the Atlanta Hawks, right? If you want to watch one NFL team, you have one option, you have the Atlanta Falcons, which I really don't want to mention the Atlanta Falcons because, well, you see the season, you see how it's going. Yeah. No. On the flip side, another example of a geographical monopoly would be in rural areas in the middle of nowhere, in that country town where there's the nearest store is like 20 miles away. That store that's 20 miles away has a geographic monopoly because it's the only store that everybody goes to. So they have a monopoly on that area since they're the only one, right? They can charge whatever they want for their prices because where else is everybody going to go? It might be 60 or 70 miles to get to Walmart. So this is the closest store we have. Therefore, that store has a geographic monopoly. All right, so the third monopoly type that we're going to talk about is government monopolies. Now, very simple. Government monopolies, the number one example would be the United States Postal Service, right? Our mail. They have a monopoly on the mailing system. So there is no other option outside of UPS or FedEx, which they mail packages, right? They compete with the post office, but when it comes to certain government mail and federal mail, it goes through the USPS, the United States Postal Service. So there's only one of them, right? Another example of a government monopoly would be the police department. I can't just put a blue light on my car and start pulling people over just because I want to. The police have a monopoly in policing. Fire department has a monopoly in terms of putting out fires, right? So those agencies have what's known as a government monopoly. All right, so the fourth type of monopoly, the last one, we're talking about a technological monopoly. Now, this is where government allows certain businesses that come up with new items, brand new concepts, brand new gadgets. They allow them to go uncontested for a period of time by giving them patents and copyrights, so that eliminates competition for a little while so they can make profit, right? A good example would be whoever comes up with the cure or the vaccine for coronavirus. The government's going to have them under contract, and they will be able to produce the vaccine for coronavirus uncontested for a certain amount of time as kind of a reward for them for coming up with the vaccine, right? So that's going to allow them to prosper and profit off of their creation. So that is a technological monopoly. This also happened in the 90s with Microsoft. Bill Gates, he came up with the Microsoft program. So virtually everybody who bought computers had to buy Microsoft in order to have a operable computer for it to work, right? So once again, the government hates monopolies, but in certain situations it makes sense for them to have monopolies. So those are the four types of monopolies. Remember, natural monopolies, utility companies; technological monopolies, government giving people that come up with new medication or new technology a head start that's uncontested, right? And geographical monopolies, in the middle of nowhere, the only store out there. Or it could be franchise teams like sports teams, right? Atlanta Braves, Atlanta Falcons. That's an example of geographical monopoly. And the last type of monopoly, government monopoly, right? So we're talking about the postal service, we're talking about police department, we're talking about national parks, right? Things that are set aside only for government, and they're the only ones that can entertain that commodity or that utility or industry. So I hope this helped you. Until next time, peace.